Howdy folks, Johnny here. If it's your first time to the channel, if it is not your first time to the channel, you'll notice I'm doing something a little bit different today. In technical terms, my fancy wireless microphone system has decided to be an asshole towards me today, but the show must go on, so I am using my Shure SHIT for the time being. I saw Abigail last night. A friend of mine phoned at the last minute and said his wife had changed her mind about going and asked me if I would like to take her place. So of course I said yes, but I was clear and upfront about the fact I had no intentions of putting out, even though it was technically his date night. Abigail opens everywhere this weekend, I'm pretty sure. It is the latest movie offering from the dynamic director duo Tyler Gillett and Matt Bertnerney, collectively known as Radio Silence. And for any of you that don't know, Tyler and Matt were part of a YouTube channel before they got into all these feature-length movies. These are the guys who brought us 2019's Ready or Not, and I am mentioning that for a reason. They're also responsible for Scream 5 and Scream 6, but we don't talk about those movies around here much, because I don't wanna. Guy Busick wrote Abigail alongside the Irish writer Stephen Shields. Guy Busick also wrote 2019's Ready or Not, which I'm also mentioning for a reason. Now, the movie itself, it is technically a monster movie. It's also technically based on one of the original classic monster movies. And I can't say anything beyond that because it would absolutely spoil everything. I don't want to wreck your weekend. And yes, if you are wondering, it does feel like I'm doing some kind of karaoke video. Imagine how hard you'd get booed off the stage for narrating a YouTube video for karaoke. Oh right, speaking of which, spoiling things. Okay, I have to put on my serious face and voice for a second here. If you're considering watching Abigail and you have not seen the trailer yet, do yourself a huge favor. Don't watch this review, do not watch the trailer, go see the movie without knowing anything about it. Yes, technically that was 3 big favors I've suggested you do for yourself, but I think you're worth it. Right, that is my disclaimer, out of the way. This will be a spoiler-free review, but as if I didn't hate Universal enough already, they take the pennies we make reviewing their movies on YouTube because they know we're too small an entity to take their asses to court. Anyways, for reasons best known to themselves, they've decided to feature this movie's big twist prominently in all of the trailers. This movie's about a gang of kidnappers. Their job's really simple. All they have to do is watch a little girl named Abigail, whom they are holding inside this giant mansion in exchange for a ransom. And as I'm sure you can probably guess, as the night progresses, the tables turn, and the kidnappers find out Abigail is actually...
Joey?
Yeah.
I'm sorry about what's gonna happen to you.
A vampire. Last night before we went into the theater, I made the decision not to watch the trailer, and I am super glad I didn't. I did watch the trailer after I got home. Their decision to reveal everything really confuses me, but even knowing the twists, this is still a very good movie. As soon as the kidnappers figure out what's actually going on, the standard plot line follows. Abigail tracks them all down, one at a time, within this giant mansion and finishes them off in rather spectacular fashion. Now, normally, this exact setup wouldn't work for me at all, because this sort of plotline doesn't give my brain anything to play with. They introduce the cast members, they show you a quick flash of the monster, and then everybody dies. In fact, despite me being a massive Dracula fan, that is exactly why Last Voyage of the Demeter didn't work for me. It felt like 90% of the plot was just waiting to see the next crew member get killed, especially given they stripped away all Dracula's charm and charisma by reducing him to an angry, hairless cat. So Abigail would have ended up being the exact same thing, I'm assuming, if it wasn't for the cast. Abigail herself was played by a young Irish actress, Alicia Weir, who I was not familiar with before this movie. I mean, I'm aware she was in some musical version of Matilda, but I haven't seen it. See, when single men my age without kids of their own watch movies like Matilda, the musical, the police often end up coming to speak to them. Anyways, for a 14-year-old kid, let me tell you, she has got a lifetime's worth of acting jobs in front of her if this movie is anything to go by. She's essentially playing 2 characters. They are polar opposites, and I believed both of them completely. She sold the terrified little girl character. You can probably imagine her playing quite easily, but more importantly, she also sold the idea that terrified little girl character was just an act. The success of this movie hinges entirely on whether or not you believe the Abigail character. If you don't buy into her early on, obviously you're not going to care what happens in the second half of the movie. Think about Kathy Bates in Misery, or Toni Collette in Hereditary. Alicia Weir basically carried this entire story herself. At 14 14 years old. When I was 14, I could barely make it 24 hours without wiping out on my BMX. For example, there's a point in the story when Abigail delivers a monologue. And I mean, it feels like a solid 2 to 3 minutes of screen time. Now, normally, if you're honest, you would probably find yourself tolerating the young actress, well, firstly because she's adorable, but also because you would know she is clearly in the process of learning how to act, and so you'd be patient. But I found myself drawn right into what she was saying, and I can say the same for the rest of the characters, so hats off to the casting department. Each of the kidnappers were nicknamed after a member of the Rat Pack, and if you're under 30, Google it. The main kidnapper they focus on is Melissa Barrera's character, Joey. Up until now, I haven't thought much about Melissa Barrera's acting either way. I did feature her film, Bed Rest, in one of my first view reactions last year. The story was so ridiculous, I felt like I'd been doing abdominal crunches for the entire 90-minute runtime. However, she did really well in this movie. English actor Dan Stevens, whom I'm only really familiar with from his role in 2020's horror thriller The Rental. He plays Frank, who's like an old-school hard man who sees empathy and kindness as weaknesses. Catherine Newton, who I only kind of know from Lisa Frankenstein, plays Sammy. She's from a well-off family, but she's turned all sour on life and become a hacker. William Catlett plays Rickles, and he is the team's sniper. Kevin Durant, who's a Canadian actor that's been in a bajillion movies, plays the big dumb muscly guy on the team. And Angus Cloud plays a stoner getaway driver, rather ironically after passing away in real life last July from a drug overdose. And the entire kidnapping gang is led by Lambert, who's played by Giancarlo Esposito. And he simply instructs his crew to keep all of the doors locked over the next 24 hours while Abigail is held hostage inside.
Keep the doors locked and the girl isolated. See you in 24 hours, my lovely pack of rats.
This movie is basically a chamber piece, meaning the whole thing takes place in the one location inside of this giant mansion. I mentioned earlier, this movie differentiates itself from a typical creature feature because of its cast. Yes, there is a monster in the form of a vampire tracking everybody down. And yes, the vampire is fairly successful, but the difference here is they've given each team member a personality and their own motivations for being there. To use my earlier example again for comparison, to me, the crew of the Demeter were nothing more than henchmen for Dracula to make Capri Sun blood bags out of to sip upon during his oceanic voyage. But you actually end up liking some of the crew in Abigail. You might even find yourself attached to some of the ones you don't like. And that's just a result of the writers putting a bit of effort into the character development, and it makes such a big difference because it elevates them from simple meals to sympathetic characters that we can relate to. In terms of this movie's action and excitement and aesthetics, nobody in history has ever lumped those things together like that in a movie review. This movie is exactly what you would expect from these two directors. I'm a big fan of their 2019 movie Ready or Not, and Abigail reminded me of it a few times. Obviously, the settings are nearly identical, being inside a dark mansion, but it was also very similar in terms of tone and pacing and the way all the characters interacted with each other. In terms of visuals, there was a lot of well-lit darkness within the house. As I'm sure you're aware, vampires and sunlight don't make very good partners, if you're on the vampire team, I mean. And you get to appreciate that well-lit darkness visual a few times when the sun manages to poke its way in. The set design, meaning the mansion itself, was also very well put together. The longer the story goes on, the more interlocking rooms and secret doors present themselves to the kidnappers. Now, in terms of criticism, I mentioned the Ready or Not vibe. Obviously, when you're watching a movie made by somebody that has made other movies, you are going to notice certain similarities and things repeating themselves. To a certain extent, you can just chalk that up as the filmmaker's style, and most decent directors have their own signature style. For example, Zack Snyder is visually flamboyant. Wes Anderson intentionally places his characters right in the middle of the frame. Tim Burton drapes giant black gothic lingerie over his entire sets. But without getting into too much detail, to me, a lot of Abigail felt as though it had been copy and pasted from Ready or Not, which is to say they lifted certain elements that really worked from their previous Locked in a Dark Mansion movie and used them as is without adding anything to them. Now, obviously, for anybody who hasn't seen Ready or Not, this isn't even going to be an issue, but I have seen it a couple of times and the similarities distracted me, to the extent if their next movie is set inside any kind of a building, I will probably skip it until it hits streaming. Beyond that minor little gripe, this movie works really well because the entire cast works really well. There are hints of good in the bad characters and hints of bad in the good characters, and that makes them slightly more complex than what you are probably expecting from what's essentially a horror comedy. Now, in terms of a recommendation, taking my little issue with Ready or Not fully into consideration, I would 100% recommend Abigail. It is a fast-paced, well-acted, competently written vampire story, and I guarantee you, if they'd have had the foresight not to include her identity in the trailer, this could have been the big hit of 2024. If you've seen the trailer and you go see Abigail anyways, please come back here and let me know what you thought about it. I would love to know how it affected your viewing, if it did at all. Until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that video you just watched, although I'm sure you know who I am, right? You should subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost anything, it's easy to do, and it makes creative people like myself who thrive on compliments feel all warm and fuzzy. And if you like that last video, click on this next video because it's just as amazing. Click on it.